Welcome everyone to panel 1, Playful Pedagogy. Today we're going to be talking all about board games and education and what we can learn from play spaces and playing board games. Our first panelist then will be Kamyab Ghorbanpour and Kjell Hedgard Hugaas, and they will be talking about imagination is free, how tabletop RPGs are creating uncensored exploratory play spaces for Iranian youth.
Thank you so much. Shell, would it be possible to share?
Absolutely. Let's see. I'm going to host disabled participant screen sharing, so I can't share my screen. Shelly.
And you're muted, so we can't hear you.
Try
this
that.
Is always
Apologies. Yes,
being first. This is what happens.
As I jumped in, I realized probably we should have tested that before Evan pressed go, but that's okay.
Yep.
We will be your guinea pigs. No worries.
By now, everybody's used to this kind of, right? They'll just fast forward through the video later. It'll be all right.
There we go. I think we got it now. Let's try this. If everybody can see this.
Right.
Yes.
Should I start?
Please feel free.
All right. So we're going to talk about the RPG scene in Iran and how it relates to the topic of bleed. Would you please go to the next slide? All right. So Iran is a country with a very massive history. Iran lays claim to a rich and a storied heritage centered around board games such as nard, chess, and so forth. Despite having such a rich history of tabletop gaming, a pivotal juncture in Iran's history changed everything in 1979. A political revolution followed by a cultural revolution implemented by the Ayatollah put a ban on many forms of entertainment, including games such as card games, poker, chess, and so forth. The country opened up a little bit after the Iran-Iraq War and the death of the Ayatollah, which led to some interesting changes in the country. Next slide, please. A renowned French designer called Dominique Erhardt once visited the country, a game designer, in 2021, and he was amazed at the number of board game cafes in the country, something he hadn't seen anywhere else. Due to sanctions and the segregation of genders in public spaces, a massive culture of board games and tabletop gaming was cultivated in the country among the youth. Something that starting with deception games such as Werewolf, but then was followed by role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons. And the reason I mentioned that segregation of genders is because it provided the space for all genders to mingle, something that doesn't often happen in public spaces. Next slide, please. Now, the popularity of these games has been big enough for the government to take notice and take actions, certain actions, such as cracking down on certain board game cafes, as well as producing their own tabletop games. However, role-playing hasn't been quite under the radar yet. Next slide, please. Now, the reason it hasn't been under the radar and it has been very difficult for them to crack down on specifically on RPGs is because very difficult to target something that is related to one's imagination. And this this type of gaming usually comes from telling stories and playing as different characters, and it relies on one's imagination instead of something that is more tangible. So it's very difficult to crack down on it. The role-playing games in board game cafes also provide a safe haven for young people, both in terms of physicality, because they can, unlike other public spaces as I mentioned, mingle together, and also they can find a space that is outside of the gaze of the morality police. But also it provides a safe space in terms of mentality, because people can express themselves freely without the fear of persecution, which would lead us to the next slide. Our research is centered around the term free, which has a double meaning. Free can refer to the low cost of gaining access to these games, because they are often downloaded or pirated illegally online, and it requires very little amount of money to be spent on them. And due to sanctions, as well as the economic collapse and the hardship that Iran and Iranians are going through, the US dollar is really difficult to gain access to, and it makes it very difficult for these sort of games to, for example, digital games or Euro games and games of that nature to become available for Iranians. However, RPG games in particular are very easy to access because they can just be easily pirated and very little is required for you to play. And also another meaning of free would be the censorship that is very difficult to implement on these games, because as I mentioned before, it's hard to target something that is not quite tangible and censor it, which has added to its popularity. And these games and board game cafes have been very popular among LGBTQ plus people, as well as other marginalized people, such as ethnic minorities, because they can express themselves and experience something different that would be otherwise very difficult under different circumstances. And now Kjell would be able to explain this phenomenon in more detail.
Thank you, Kami. Our research into these environments is based on the understanding that when role-playing games are scaffolded with safety and post-game integration in mind, they can function as transformational containers. In other words, spaces in which players are not only allowed to experiment and explore in-game, but also provide them with potential to integrate their experiences into their real lives. And I do this when I say real lives, because it's, of course, there's no fake and real here. The player and the character are experiencing much of the same things. Games can do this by providing the alibi that we need to escape forms of social policing that we might ordinarily be subject to. And alibi then becomes the ritual that allows us to enter another space, and it provides role players the opportunity to experience engaging in a different world, functioning on a different set of principles and rules, and also being able to shapeshift and experience another way of being themselves, or a character, to explore different senses of self. This here graphic was used by Dr. Sarah Lynn Bowman and me a couple years ago in an article we created. Just going to explain it very briefly. As you can see on the left side, you have your daily identity, yourself, and everything, safety, structure, communities, but everything you bring into the game in the middle here. And we have a border, or a not a border, it's possible to transfer over. And inside the magic circle, which is a term I believe most of you will know, and the social contract created by alibi, we play and we try out new things. Then after the game, we integrate this into our daily identity, and our sense of self is now changed. There are numerous ways in which RPGs can influence players, and in our research we have specifically chosen to use the lens of bleed and bleed theory. So for those not familiar, bleed is, very simply said, the spillover between character and player, but also vice versa. When it goes from character to player, we call it bleed out. When it goes from player to character, we call it bleed in. What most people might not be aware of is that from its early beginnings back in 2007, when Emily Care Boss first used it at Ropicon, and Marcus Montla then got into writing a few years later in 2010, there's been a lot of theory work happening on bleed the last 15, 16 years or so. So now we have, for instance, emotional bleed, which is probably the thing that they were talking about in the beginning. We also have added ego bleed, where archetypal qualities and identity patterns bleed over. We have procedural bleed, which relates to physical abilities and so on. Mimetic bleed, ideas, thought, opinions, convictions, ideologies, and similar cognitive constructs. Now, if you look at the graphic here on the right, you see these four columns: emotional, ego, mimetic, and procedural. They are what we are calling basic bleed components. They might combine into more complex versions of bleed. And here we have on this graphic, we have relationship bleed, where the relationships between players after the game change. Romantic bleed is, of course, the most known. Characters falling in love after the game. Are the players in love? Who knows? It can be very complicated. We have identity bleed, the sense of self and identity might shift. And we have emancipatory bleed, coined by Jonaya Kemper, where players from marginalized backgrounds experience liberation from that marginalization through their characters. Click there, yes. In our research, we believe that the bleed components of emotional bleed, ego bleed, and mimetic bleed can combine into the bleed complex of emancipatory bleed, allowing the players to experience how liberation from the oppression that they live with in their everyday can feel like. In this, mimetic bleed plays a crucial role. So we're going to unpack that a little bit, the little time we have left. This is the definition, original definition of mimetic bleed. I'm not going to read all of it, but it's about cognitive constructs bleeding from player to character, character to player. In our research, we're looking at bleed out, so things we experience, ideas, ideologies, all these things that we get that we get exposed to in game. We can take them with us out into our real lives afterwards. But this second paragraph here about mimetic bleed, it also means that mimetic bleed has both an individual, the first part, and also a community part. And to try to explain what that community part means, I'm going to use an example from my own background. Personally, I've been part of the Nordic LARP tradition for a very long time. Regarding this structural component of mimetic bleed, I propose that the spread in Nordic LARP communities of ideas and values found in intersectional feminism is partly due to it being a memeplex that for years has been central in both content and design choices in a variety of Nordic LARPs that have one way or another set the contemporary standard. Of course, this might be a question of whether feminist LARPers want feminist LARPs or if feminist LARPs create feminist LARPers, but personally I think the answer is probably a mix of the two. There is no getting around the fact, though, that we somehow seem to have gotten a lot better at making LARPs that incorporate these ideals, though, and it stands as an example of how mimetic bleed can affect ideology and politics on a structural level. Now, whether this is also the case in Iranian RPG communities is something that we hope our research will be able to better illuminate in the future. So, in conclusion, very briefly, tabletop role-playing games are easily available and popular in Iran. The games provide spaces for play that exist outside of the reach of the government censorship programs. They can function as safer exploratory spaces for the players, allowing them to explore parts of their identity, their social context, and even the systems that they live under. some games might be experienced as transformational containers, allowing the experiences to spill over to the players' real lives through bleed out. These bleed experiences can then compound into bleed complexes that have profound effects on the players, leading to significant changes in relationships and identity. They can also be experienced as emancipatory for the players who live with marginalizations and oppression. Here are some of our references. Going to keep that up for a couple of seconds so that you can pause the YouTube video you're watching sometime in the future. Hi, future. And thank you so much for listening to us. And thank you for having us at Generation Analog.
Hooray! Yes, there's so many applause happening right now on the screen. Thank you both so much. We are going to hold off questions until everybody's gone. So please, keep thinking about those good questions. Hold them until after everybody else is gone, and then afterwards we'll have time for a nice, rich discussion that maybe some ideas we can bounce back and forth. So thank you both again. Our next presentation our next talk why don't we start thinking about who's presenting the slides for our tabletop games on critical environmental education and evaluation of Lacerda's CO2 Second Chance. So this talk is by Clever Pinto, Saullo Soares, Gabriel Miranda, Valquíria Albuquerque, and Carolina Spiegel.
Hi.
Yes,
Hi.
thank you, Clever.
Hi, people. May I share my screen? I guess I can.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And yeah, whenever you are ready, please feel free to go ahead.
Nice. Sound, please.
Yeah, so, well, I'll start. Good morning, everyone. My name is Saullo, and together here with Clever, Gabriel, Valquíria, and Carolina. The girls couldn't come today, but we'll talk for them now. We are part of the Ludwig and Insight Education Research Group with members spread all over Brazil. Our collective efforts also extend to the Ludus Magisterium Collective, where we collaborate with fellow researchers, teachers, and also game designers. And we are all dedicated to the development, testing, and use of playful and educational methodologies. Moreover, we are proud affiliates of the Foundation Oswaldo Cruz in Brazil, a preeminent Latin American institute deeply committed to the One Health system and also to science dissemination. And we are glad to share with you all today one of our latest studies entitled Tabletop Games on Critical Environmental Education, an evaluation of Lacerda CO2 Second Chance. I'll pass. And we are glad that this year's conference theme centers around the bias play. We acknowledge that all games possess bias within their system, mechanics, and design, whether it's intentionally introduced by the game designer or not. And some of these biases may remain concealed sometimes and demand a closer examination and interpretation to surface it. And drawing inspiration from Paulo Freire, the Brazilian patron of education, we embrace this notion that education, like in games, it's inherently based and cannot be neutral at all. Rather, it can be considered a political act. And thus, we can extend this perspective to the effects of playing itself, especially when employed tabletop games for educational purpose. And no, I can pass myself, thanks. Notably, initiatives such as the Games for Change and many others underscore the importance of games that tackle real-world and urgent significant issues, from economic and political crises to humanitarian and environmental challenges, like the last one that we passed for the COVID-19 and the game pandemic is just an example of many others, with the ultimate aim of fostering awareness and also inspiring actionable change on people. And one of these themes then is the pressing global issue of the environmental and climate crisis that put at risk the survival and welfare of all global biodiversity and also humanity, although in varying ways. And in response to this, many countries have been developing environmental education initiatives, with the majority aligned with the Sustainable Development Agenda, known for its more pragmatical approach. While this approach contributes in certain respects, it falls short in addressing the profound systemic challenges arising from the limited growth and production ideal, with even higher and higher consumption uh, characteristic from our capitalistic society. Regrettably, in terms of the terms sustainable development, it has been co-opted by some major polluting enterprise engaging in what we call greenwashing, that is distorting its original meaning and also its original purpose. And in light of this situation, new educational strategies have been emerged, including the critical environmental education. These perspectives recognize that the current social environmental crisis stems from the destructive relationships that we humans have been adopting for the environment and between ourselves, and also inspired by Paulo Freire pedagogy. The critical environmental education empowers students to adopt an active role in becoming conscious and critical citizens concerning not only about their own surroundings, but also advocating for the well-being of all global societies and biodiversity. And it takes a more provocative approach, challenging unsustainable foundations and proposing also profound transformations that are necessary for the long-term societal welfare that we seek and need. And complex themes like these demand some innovative methods to make it more comprehensible to students. And Tabletop's games prove to be an invaluable resource, offering accessible, playful, and meaningful means to explore these various facets of this urgent and critical context. And this study that we will present and shed light to the potential of the tabletop game still do second chance as an educational tool in fostering environment critical education. I'll pass the word to Gabriel now.
Okay, thank you, Saullo. So as the game CO2 Second Chance explores the climatic issue in a meaningful way, from now on we are going to focus our presentation on this game. And it was designed by Vital Lacerda and published in 2018 by Geoshix. And according to the game's rulebook, in the game CO2 Second Chance, each player is the CEO of an energy company responding to the government request for new green power plants. So the goal of the game is to stop the increase of pollution while meeting the rising demand for sustainable energy, and of course, to profit by doing so. This is what the rulebook says. And to beat the game, the players must achieve the United Nations goals and keep the atmospheric concentration of CO2 always below 500 parts per million over 5 phases during four decades that are the game rounds. And the main flow of actions through the game is to propose a project, to prepare an infrastructure based on that project, and to build a power plant over that infrastructure that was prepared. Also, the game has two modes of play: a competitive mode, which has a certain degree of cooperation, and a fully cooperative mode. So this is a general view of the game. And so based on this that we present to you, the aim of this study was to evaluate the cooperative mode of CO2 Second Chance under the lens of environmental education. So, by the way, our intention on choosing this game mode is because of the need to use cooperative games to discuss complex issues of the world that demand collaboration between different levels of society. And to accomplish this, our goal, we played the cooperative mode of the game several times, and then we discussed our impressions and remarks on present and hidden elements of the game rules, of the game mechanics, narrative, of the game components and iconography. And then we discuss how those elements are related to environmental education. And then, as the result of this evaluation, several relevant topics were emerged, and these topics will be now pointed out by Clever.
Thank you, Gabriel. The evaluation we conducted showed that the game is successful in presenting a complex system in a simple manner, as we show ahead. It is noteworthy to mention that the rulebook of the game offers context within the reality it is built upon, and it's appreciated addition. Others aspects were observed. One of them was the reforestation instead of a power plant. The game designer emphasizes in the rulebook the relevance of reforestation in combating the climate crisis. And as we know, reforestation efforts are helpful in capturing atmospheric carbon. Another aspect observed is that the game features the 5 continents, each with different energy demands. And this highlights that different parts of the globe have different needs and requirements, and to address them, different solutions should be presented. The game also consists of 4 rounds representing 40 years. This long-term perspective contrasts with the continuous need for more power plants. If players fail to implement a power plant on a continent, a fossil fuel one will take place, increasing atmospheric carbon levels and worsening the crisis. We also noticed that scientists are involved in the implementation of power plants and in summits where they share and produce more knowledge. It reinforces that the solution to the climate crisis involves science. We also can observe that even to implement green energy solutions, such as hydroelectric and wind power plants, there are impacts. In the iconography of the purple carbon emission permits discs, we can see the image of a school, which raises questions about how truly green a technology is. What are the impact of these technologies on the environment and populations? Recent events in Brazil showed us that the Belo Monte hydroelectric dam destroyed a vast area of the Amazon rainforest and displaced also numerous families from riverside communities. Well, these considerations are not necessarily given. Some people may play the CO2 without giving much thought on these issues. However, when educators use the game for educational purposes, we can bring to the forefront these considerations. So it's crucial to understand that games are simplifications. Even though they aim to address real-world issues, not all of their complexity will be fully represented in them. We should overlook and accept simplifications and omissions in that case. And here we highlight the role of educators who can also address what is left unsaid. That is, use the game as a starting point to expand on problematizations. Thus, educators are vital to enhance learning and explore other perspectives. An educator can use board games that present pragmatic perspectives and from there promote critical environmental approach. For example, in the board game in question, educators can provoke and question other issues that are essential to critical environmental education, such as what kind of reforestation are we talking? Does it only aim to capture atmospheric carbon using the most efficient species, or does it also seek to restore environments considering their native species? Recycling is a relevant process, but ends up as a downcycling, where recycled materials are used in lower quality products compared to the original ones. Attention must be given to reducing consumption, both in materials and energy. And we need to question ourselves, would be there enough resources if all the 8 billion people consumed like I do? We can see the presence of corporations and governments, but it's necessary to discuss the participation of other sectors of society in the decision-making process, especially concerning marginalized communities. Thus, the CO2 game is highly suitable for educational purposes. However, we understand there is a complex and lengthy game. Nevertheless, it is well suited for workshops and extracurricular activities. Additionally, educators can use some parts of the game or partial gameplay experience. We emphasize the fundamental role of educators and their creativity in designing these activities. Therefore, our expectations with this work are precisely to contribute to the expansion of discussion about critical environmental education and to inspire fellow educators to reflect together, whether by adapting and designing activities, adapting games, or even creating entirely new ones. So people, this is our contribution to this conference, and thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you all so much. This has been wonderful. Yes, round of applause for all of our panelists. Thank you again. And also, I just want to say a special thank you to all of our panelists so far. I've been, everybody's been right on time, and I really appreciate that. So let's keep that going for the whole con. I haven't had to, nobody's had to go over and, be, anyways, we'll keep going. All right. I told you, it doesn't matter. I'm going to always be awkward. All right. Our next speaker is Thomas Yount, and they will be talking with us about fighting doom bias with analog games. Thomas, please feel free to take it away.
Thanks so much, Shelly. Can you hear me? Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here with everyone. What amazing presentations we've just had. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and take it away and share my screen now. All right. So my name is Thomas Yount, and I'm the founder of an independent gaming company called Clean Earth Future. And Clean Earth Future's mission is to provide educational games, environmentally focused game-based learning materials, and more. I'm really excited to announce that Climate Cooldown has just been released, which is really exciting. Should all take a look. And yeah, without further ado, let's just get right into it. So fighting doom bias with analog games. Let's talk about it. Just to do a little overview here, I'm going to do a little theoretical framework talking about doom bias, game-based learning, game making and education, then talk about the creation of Climate Cooldown. After that, I'll talk about some examples of other climate games and some conclusions and some suggestions for future study. So what is doom bias? Doom bias refers to a cognitive or psychological tendency in individuals or groups to focus disproportionately on negative or pessimistic outcomes, particularly when it comes to interpreting information or predicting future events. It's a type of cognitive bias that can influence how people perceive and react to information, often leading to a heightened sense of fear, anxiety, or a perception that things are really worse than they actually are. Another term that we can take a look at is climate doomism. Kletzka talks about it as an idea that we're past the point of being able to fight the climate breakdown, and that humanity is likely to go extinct. Doomism is a counterproductive thing, and it ignores the lived reality of people around the world who are already affected by climate change and do not have the luxury of just giving up. In a recent study, it showed over the past 20 years plus now, it's all increased: anger, fear, disgust, and sadness on the media. We are likely familiar at this point with doom scrolling, something that's been talked about for a while now. Constantly checking our phones, seeing disturbing messages, news articles online, clickbait, and what have you. Negativity bias, similar to what I would talk about as doom bias, is the tendency for negative information and experiences to overwhelm the positive. Ray talks about how media can be addictive, and its negativity bias is shown to be destructive to mental health. In the book Merchants of Doubt, just to kind of touch base really quickly on the climate crisis, specifically in relation to doom bias, global warming would become the mother of all environmental issues because it struck at the very root of economic activity, the use of energy. So perhaps not surprisingly, the same people who had questioned acid rain, doubted the ozone hole, and defended tobacco now attacked the scientific evidence of global warming. This posed a certain problem because obviously not dealing with it wouldn't be good. Ray talks about this. It would be foolish not to freak out over climate change, but it would be sad if that despair kept you from working hard on this crisis, not to mention enjoying life on what is still a beautiful planet. Ray talks about climate anxiety, as does Lowe, as distress about climate change and its impacts on the landscape and human existence. Looking at some other terms in eco-psychology briefly, we have eco-despair, eco-grief, solastalgia, and eco-guilt. Joanna Macy talks about doom as well. She says how we're caught between a sense of impending apocalypse and the fear of acknowledging it. Unless we find ways of acknowledging and integrating that anguished awareness, we repress it. And with that repression, we are drained of the energy we need for action. Andrew Boyd, in his book, which I highly recommend, I Want a Better Catastrophe, talks about how he doesn't want to encourage premature despair with talk of doom, but he also doesn't want to bullshit himself or anyone else with false hopes. Also, on doomsaying, he says how raw doomsaying can be a form of cruelty. If you're going to tell people how bad it is, you become ethically responsible for also offering some kind of solution or hopeful story or winning strategy. In Adrienne Marie Brown's book, Emergent Strategy, she talks about imagination in some really powerful ways. How do we cultivate the muscle of radical imagination needed to dream together beyond fear? Adrienne talks about how she often feels that she's trapped inside someone else's imagination. She must engage my own imagination in order to break free. We have to imagine beyond those fears. We have to ideate, imagine, and conceive together. We need to move from a competitive ideation, trying to push our individual ideas, to collective ideation, collaborative ideation. It isn't about having the number one best idea, but having ideas that come from and work for more people. So my proposition is that the act of gameplay with game-based learning and game making and education could be considered as a means to combat the mental shackles of doom bias, to reimagine the future, modeled in a new way that we can create together. Let's talk about game-based learning for a moment. Game-based learning could be described as the use of games to encourage learning. Specifically, board games can be a very effective means to promote active learning when children are engaged in some activity that forces them to reflect upon ideas and how they're using those ideas. Cooperative board games are games that aim to awaken aspects of cooperation and solidarity within participants. they're an excellent resource to exercise teamwork and the passive solution of conflicts. So let's also look at this other topic of game making and education, brought to my attention by Steele 2 years ago. GME, or game making and education, is an educational approach which emphasizes student game making rather than just gameplay. Rather than designing a game from scratch, students might instead be offered a partially finished educational game, perhaps designed by the teacher, and tasked with hacking and modding it in a way that brings educational goals into focus. In another approach, an instructor could ask students to play a popular game about a subject matter that's broken. For example, the popular board game Pandemic from 2008 doesn't quite fit accurately or reflect the virology or history of medicine, and then ask them to fix it by redesigning the game to be more accurately reflecting the subject matter. And I think we all kind of know a little bit about this now after COVID's broken out, but here's a photo of the Earth Games lab at the University of Washington playing Climate Cooldown. And I want to say how Climate Cooldown and games like it can offer students a way to explore possible interpretations for the outcomes of predicaments like the climate crisis. During the development and prototyping phase of Climate Cooldown, students at the Earth Games lab at University of Washington played the game and were able to discuss ways in which Climate Cooldown modeled real-life scenarios. During this same course, students developed their own analog or digital games surrounding the topic of atmospheric science and climate. So I'd like to talk briefly about Climate Cooldown now as a case for game-based learning and game making and education. When it all started, I was thinking, how do we combat this doom bias? You know, we have all of these issues and there's got to be a way to kind of simplify it, not oversimplify it too much, but enough to like get some really important ideas across to everyone. So I started with this idea of global warming needing a meter, some sort of temperature for the planet. So I brought in a meter. There's many versions of it, of course, and here's one of them. This is the final version. And with that meter, I didn't want to focus too much on the actual specific percentages or decimals, for example. I wanted to make the game a little bit more friendly for a wider variety of ages, and so I actually kept it to whole numbers. However, when we're talking about global warming, I was also thinking, all right, well, what's causing the global warming? We have our Anthropocene era and we have our impact on the planet. So I thought it would also be useful to talk about having a impact meter. And that was something that I hadn't seen in other games specifically. The idea of an impact meter would be lower, like something that we could lower our emissions. The game starts at 15, and that's at a high point, and we try to bring our impact down as one of the crucial goals to winning the game. You also see on the map there's O's and L's for ocean and land, where I felt it would be important to focus on healing the planet, both in the land and the sea. I wanted to add regions so that players could play together specifically, kind of have their own place to have resources they can use and track their progress in the game. On a specific region, it was hard to decide exactly what to include, but this is what I came up with that I'm very happy with now. You can see where there's resource cards that are drawn on the bottom. There's energy, water, and food. You can also increase your amount or decrease with tokens. And you'll see on the top part, there's a tornado, which represents disaster cards. There's disaster cards such as deforestation, which can add to the global meter. You can see the red arrows there indicating the increase. There's also cooldown cards, which are like climate solutions. And you can see there's some blue arrows there, which is a decrease to the impact meter. And moving on, there are cards that are unsustainable and sustainable as far as power goes. Coal is one of the unsustainable, which increases the impact meter, but it does give you energy. And this is an important lesson in the game that I really wanted to push, was that you also have sustainable power, but it does increase the global meter. Part of that's due to materials extraction and other issues involving the process of developing the technology. So you need to have two in order to divest. That is another thing. I probably, would want to include, far more, but in order to simplify the game and make it fun, I decided on the number 2 for how many it would take to divest from a fossil fuel such as coal. Now, there's other cards such as afforestation that are cooldown cards. This one has a tree on it, and that represents the impact of restoring the land. And here's another ocean cleanup for the ocean. And these are how you get the tokens that you put on the map. Now, down below in the bottom right, you'll see there's diplomacy tiles. These diplomacy tiles represent our ability to donate to one another and to help each other. These are the resource cards. In the game, one of the important lessons is sharing and donating. You can trade, you can donate once you have diplomacy, but you can't waste food. So at the end of a round, if all you have is food left, that's a problem. It's going to cause methane to be released. So that's going to increase the global meter. This is yet another lesson that I really wanted to instill. So just a quick overview. The dynamics and relationships of global warming and our impact on the planet is a main crucial component of the game. Some others are the anthropogenic and natural disasters relating to climate change. Existing climate solutions we have to help reduce our impact and heal the earth. The need to replace existing unsustainable power with sustainable power in order to transition and divest from unsustainable power sources. The impacts of investing in even sustainable power sources, like I talked about. The issue of food waste and food distribution. The importance of collaboration and diplomacy in order to tackle the crisis cooperatively. So let's just take a quick look at some games. I'm not going to have time to go through all of them, but just very briefly, here's some that I really liked. And I haven't had a chance to play Daybreak just yet, but I've liked all these other games. Really briefly, the board game solutions I think is wonderful in many ways. One that I really liked is how it was great for encouraging discussion about climate solutions. Fellow players must strategize to arrange solutions on the scale of their effectiveness from high to low. I thought it was a really interesting way to talk about things. Also, the game encourages you to talk about businesses or projects that might be tailored around these solutions. Another great application. Global warning is interesting. Players have to match solution cards to problem cards based on local impact, global impact and values they have to pay. I find this really helpful as well to make connections between climate-related problems we face and their potential solutions. Well, looks like I'm getting pretty close to running out of time, so I'll keep moving here. So perks of climate cooldown. It is heavily cooperative. You must look out for one another on the whole time as we contribute to the impact on the planet. For example, food waste increases emissions, so we work together to share and use the food. You must first invest in diplomacy in order to help each other win the game. Helping each other is a deliberate choice that must be made. There is recognition for the impact of all sources of power, whether they're sustainable or unsustainable. There are 2 meters in the game, one for temperature of the planet and the other for the impact on the planet. It's a key distinction. The game makes you think about how to use different resources wisely, energy, water, food, and not just how one spends money. My conclusions really quickly are that game-based learning and game-making education are effective methods for us to combat doom bias and climate doomism, as they facilitate education and discussion around these pressing topics we need to address. We need to start designing a future that we want to live in. What does it look like? A lot of people spend time complaining about the past or criticizing what's going on. We can be future focused with game-based learning and game making and education. It's like being a gardener. What's the world we want to live in and how can we cultivate that world? Suggestions for future study would be, how could game-based learning and game making and education increase community and civic engagement in different local communities? And what kinds of game-based learning materials are the most conducive at facilitating imaginative and critical thinking in regards to both learning about climate science as well as problem-solving issues that exist in local communities. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you guys all enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing your comments and communicating with more of you soon.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And yes, a wonderful round of applause for Thomas. That was excellent. And now our last panelist for this panel on playful pedagogy. Sorry, it's too many words today. We're going back to the kind of top of the order on our program, but we do have now. I made Cynthia. Yes, excellent. Just wanted to make sure the technology was working. So we have Cynthia Diaz and Arnaldo Carvalho here to present on board games, education, and diversity, perspectives and contributions from Brazil. And I think you should have sharing privileges and all that, and hopefully the tech will work. But welcome, both of you.
Thank you, Shelly. Let
Thank you
me
so much.
set our presentation. Share screen.
And I'll just take 1 second to say, if any folks have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, because after Arnaldo and Cynthia finish up, we will have a wonderful, we'll have time for a wonderful conversation. So go ahead and you can start putting those questions in. Take it away, Arnaldo and Cynthia.
So thank you. Our time is short, and so we'll introduce ourselves very fast. And we'll move our content as quickly as possible. Because of the time, you just need to know Cynthia Diaz is a PhD in design, an educator in technical health school. She works on that. While I have MSc in education, and I am also a doctoral student in education too. We'll leave this presentation public, so you can check any information in all of these texts afterwards if you want. So let's go. Cynthia, it's up to you.
So, hi, is everyone listening to me okay? So what's in for today? We have three main parts to talk about: a Brazilian review on social education and board game scene, some theoretical contributions, and some wishes. For those who don't know where Brazil is on the globe, here we are. We're gonna get there. This one below is our country. Brazil is very, very big. We are the fifth biggest country on the planet, almost the size of the whole Western Europe or the USA. And the population is also big, more than 213 million. And it has a big incoming. Brazil was almost always in the top 10 world economies. Unfortunately, we lost some positions in the last years. So we're now at the 13th position. But the coolest data about our country in this slide is we are multicultural, we're very diverse, and it reflects on the race or color declared by Brazilians. 59% declare themselves non-white, most of them brown or black.
As we said, Brazil has a huge financial incoming, but if you come here, you perceive that most of the people here live in a really difficult condition because we are vice champions in income concentration. In 2020, almost half of the country wealth went to the richest 1% of the population. Most Brazilians live with up to $730 monthly. If our average cost of life is a little bit bigger than $1,000 for a minimal, respectful life, now think about people living with less than $113 a month. They are about 80 million here. It's almost the entire German population. Yes, they receive a bit more than 2 Catan games. How can anyone within this condition dream of having a gateway board game? It's impossible. This is just a small piece of inequality Thank God we don't have enough time to make you cry with this so rich and poor country.
If we
Cynthia?
focus on the educational data, in Brazil, we have almost a quarter of our population at basic school. Most of the students are enrolled in public schools, which are free for the students and paid by our regular taxes. Now check this. If we said that people don't have a lot of purchasing power, buying a simple Catan, for example, being something extremely expensive for us, how do we maintain a live and diverse culture of board games? Maybe through some public policy or campaign, but we don't have that, as you will see soon. So we have a small number of regular players and a smaller number of collectors. This makes it hard for our market to follow big markets, such as the USA and Germany.
There are other non-economic reasons to explain why so few Brazilians play and know more than one or another old school game. Google image algorithm helps us confirm that. If you search in your browser for board game and compare with a search for jogo de tabuleiro, board game in Portuguese, you will see the image mostly present among the first results in Brazilian Portuguese will be old school games with repetitive track races, Ludo, checkers, etc. On the other hand, Google image will give you a wider, more diverse sort of board games among the results in English. This is important because it shows our challenge in education here. We have lots of kids and teenagers who never had the experience of sitting, listening to rules, asking questions, and playing a board game match. Maybe most of our kids. This means in most cases, classes have many difficulties when we offer board games a bit more complex, as CO2, for example.
So to comprehend where we are in terms of educational approaches with analog games in Brazil, mainly board games, we will cover 6 main areas that you can see here. Starting by the heart of education, schools, we can say that almost no schools have systematic plans to use board games in education. Educators didn't come from a culture of play, except digital games, for which Brazil is a huge global market. So we still dream of having something like a public quest to learn school that there was in the USA. Many teachers may not be ready or confident to try board games as an educational approach, but when directors seek fancy names as innovation projects, fun learning, neuroeducation, and students' protagonism, they can call for an outsourcing. We have some well-established companies and some well-reputed teachers dedicated and experienced with board games who sell training programs for teachers to private and public schools. And sometimes a weekly schedule of board game time with focus on cognitive and social improvements. Usually they use board game bestsellers with short play time and low learning curve. Critics say that the main issue with this model is the depersonalization of the activities, since all games are packed in some pre-sold program. Most of the time, a board game is experimented in a classroom or in any school's environment. It is by a solitary initiative of a single teacher. That's why I mainly complain about a teaching loneliness. This becomes worse when the teacher faces prejudice from their colleagues, as if they were not working, but only playing with the kids. The solitary teacher usually seeks one or more of these 3 benefits: social, cognitive, or connecting the game theme with the contents of the subject matter. Almost always, the teacher uses one of these common approaches: presenting a board game, commercial or created by her or him, creating a game or supporting the student's creation, or proposing an adaptation of a game previously known by the class, or an adaptation of a commercial game.
Yes, about our research. Sorry? Okay. Sorry, about our research centers, we have grouped universities, federal institutes of technology, and research centers as Health Foundation, Fundação Oswaldo Cruz, which has presented before. Research centers, we can perceive that the most enthusiastic places where professors and students share a common taste of exploring ludic experiences surrounding their themes of study and research. Beyond developing research, many groups have adopted the study and development of board games as products capable of bringing science and health education closer to the general public. Games have been recognized by these groups and some institutions as a good science dissemination strategy, since they bring pleasure to the contact with formal information about discoveries and more. Of course, this happens not in the majority of groups, and the researchers have sometimes to face the distrust of colleagues and fewer financial incentives. But on that environment, generally, ludic proposals are being better received. We have now dozens of research groups and initiatives on universities around Brazil with different topics in the area.
Fiocruz is the biggest research and development center in public health in Brazil, and a renowned provider of health technology, including vaccines and strategies to combat epidemics and other large public health issues. The foundation where I work has many institutes, and at least 2 of them offer graduate degrees with master's and doctoral programs where most students develop ludic projects. Also, on the science dissemination field, there are many groups exploring different themes, such as vector-borne diseases, which is this left one here, menstrual health, which is the top left corner, medicinal herbs, which is the bottom center, and the actual functioning of the Brazilian public health system, for another example of, the functioning of a lockdown during a pandemic, which is the center one. Board games, events like the programs on the right, and methodologies with board games have been multiplying in the last years in our institution. Since publicizing the games is also a big issue, there's also a team working at Fiocruz in order to develop a platform which will aggregate all games, analog and digital, inside Fiocruz, and others curated by researchers of the institution. Keep an eye out for Fiocruz Jogos, which is coming very soon.
Yes. Well, about our publishers, in the last few years, several new publishers came. The main two to publicly support education are Galapagos, an Asmodee company, and De Vere. The first uses Asmodee colossal structure, bringing the most important grant program on board game research and education, the Gaming Lab, thanks. Galapagos also promotes temporary actions to attract educators and educational institutions in order to create a public of specialized consumers. They have the biggest catalog of board games in Brazil, many of them evergreen as Dixit and Double. Easy games that teachers love here. The second one, De Vere, is also it also has a great catalog, including educational classics here, such as Codenames, Phantasma Blitz, Blitz Phantom, and Catan. But to provide interesting title is not enough to them. They have very stable educational programs, such as De Vere Scholars, De Vere Schools, who visit schools and offer free experiences for teachers and students, and De Vere Academy, who provide information and free print and play games, instructional materials, and even important books for education. Alongside, these two large companies, other large ones, such as Pepe Games, Grok, and Conclave Mitra, have given prestige to nationality authored games, although still discreet in choosing themes that represent our culture. Regarding small publishers, highlights to Malacca Games here, a group of 4 renowned Brazilian Black game designers, 100% focused on diversity, mainly Afro games. As you see here, the Favela Venceu. Other small publishers as Lampion Game Studios, Curiosos Jogos, among others, are trying to give the public small but smart and beautiful games, Brazilian themed, and with prices that can be reached by unprivileged people.
Our board game community is not very big. At a very optimistic guess, we might think that with each of 50,000 active hobbyists in subscribing the biggest channels of content creators, we can have around 500,000 people playing. It's not that bad, but this represents only 0.23% of our total Brazilians. This shows how much games, even in the new school model, which we prefer to call facing the problem of the term modern, it's not actually part of our current culture. It's a very niche community made mainly by white people from the Southeast region, the richest region, part of the richest 10% of the country. So when we work in education, we are thinking about the reality of the other 90%. So there is a big problem of social exclusion, but it's not the community's fault, since the community has been facing challenges in the pursuit of inclusivity and fighting cases of misogyny, homophobia, and racism, always maintaining inclusive stance towards non-white players. This already has immense value for education. But we don't really see a campaign concerned with the access for games by the 90%.
Yes. Most about the indie initiatives, most of the indie directly related to education with board games are from small companies or independent teachers selling training on education with board games. There are the teachers of teachers who have been very important in the growth of this field in Brazil. These educators have created a lot of didactic material with playful approaches for educational actions by companies and public and private institutions. An example of this is the didactic material made for Albert Einstein Hospital, one of the most recognized health institutions in the world, by Daniel. Indie actions also include activities for students usually occupying the same spaces as the aforementioned outsourced companies. Another indie action that has been positive is the proliferation of games created and released independently by teachers and focused on academic themes or of high pedagogical interests. The title others here refers to more singular initiatives, such as campaigns to introduce games in cultural centers or libraries, or even isolated initiatives by museums, cultural centers, or schools. To finish this in the slide, 2 important initiatives have to be mentioned. They were decisive in changing the profile of educators involved with analog games in Brazil the last years. And even their recognition and even the number and quality of their academic production. Look at Ludific Low here, this tiny company owned by just 2 professors sought a completely innovative direction to build bridges between segments of the board games ecosystem. They've aligned industry publishers and artists, and during the pandemic, connected the entire Brazilian gaming community and gaming educators. For the first time, Gen Con Online had more lectures on education in Portuguese than in any other language. And Spiegel received a huge load of board game and education content in Portuguese, and even a virtual lecture in English for Educators Day given by me and Dr. Cynthia, invited by Ludovic.
So
Go
to wrap
ahead.
it up.
Yes, yeah, we're at that
very
time. Thank you.
Okay. The last initiative we'd like to mention is Ludus Magisterium, which is a network of teachers and researchers about games, and a significant part of the national production, especially when it comes to the use of board games. With the theoretical body of education and psychology comes from members of this network. Ludus has become the magic circle of every educator who uses board games in our country, and we are very proud of that. The next slide, please, just to wrap it up. We would like more positive news about government incentives for ludic education. We have almost none. Just some small examples of mainly buying games and organizing tournaments around mainly checkers or TCG games such as Magic, stuff like this. And we would like, especially if the PNLD, which is our program, public program for didactic books, would also incorporate games as a didactic material. We're hoping, praying and fighting for that. And we have some final questions which we are thinking about. We won't have time here to approach them, but if you are interested in these questions, please contact us and we could exchange a little more afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Excellent. Yes, please, let's give a round of applause for our panelists. And yes, absolutely, we'll have more time for conversation, and we can always be on the Discord sharing slides and sharing additional resources. So yes, let's go ahead and start asking those questions. We do have some questions open in our Q&A. I'm going to try to see where we are with that, just because there's been some that have already been answered, which is great. And some folks, if you do have questions, make sure that you're phrasing your question in such a way that I can tell who you are trying to ask, because sometimes that isn't always apparent. So I'll just go with for our most recent speakers, for Diaz and Carvalho. Is there an indigenous game playing traditions that could be presented to a wider audience?
Arnaldo, do you want to answer? But yes, we have. It's not my specialty, but maybe even some of our colleagues here know more about indigenous games traditions. We have actually in our Base Nacional Comum Curricular, it's our national curriculum base. The base indicates that things should be content of our curriculum, but it does not indicate what things or how. But the cultural reference is important, and we have indigenous games and African games which make a part of our culture, and we would positively explore that. In our slide, an example of the municipality of São Paulo, which had a project with 4 different areas of games from the world, and they have games from, I think it was Go from Asia, and Jogo da Onça, which is game of the leopard, which is considered an indigenous game in Brazil, and Mancala, which is an African game, along with another one that I forgot now. And they use that to explore board games, education, public schools in São Paulo. So we have that culture, and we should really disseminate it for a wider audience. Thank you.
No, thank you. That's awesome. So in terms of, I mean, a lot of the conversations we've been having here about educational games, someone has asked for any of these kinds of educational games, have there been studies, or do you know of studies that are trying to compare in a quantitative way between teaching with games and teaching without games, measuring kind of student learning outcomes as independent groups? Or maybe we can talk about if that hasn't, like, what would be the challenges of that?
For who it was, sorry, I fell down.
That's okay. So the question is, are thinking about educational games and comparing in a quantitative way what the teaching with games versus teaching without games measures. Right.
It's I think I'll start saying something because it's so open question, but the truly answer is it depends. There are many studies that showing this, but one key word or perspective of this, it's of the context, because many students have different contexts, be it economical, geographically, cultural, and so over. So the use of the game, it should be first you have to think that if that group of students, they have the cultural habits of playing. If you show a game with some complex mechanics or rules to a group of students that never played anything at all, it will be very harsh for them. But if there is some initiative that introduce games, simple ones that game where you roll the dice and move the houses, it's a very simple, but it's good for to start with, and so on. You introduce more complex games, more sophisticated ones. It will be one approach. So a quantitative methods of analysis, it's very questionable in many ways at teaching at all, and the use of games, it's not different, but it's a very open question, but a very good one, because we have to see that.
No,
that's anyone want to compliment?
I'll chime in and say, in the research that I've done, I haven't seen anything so specific as to say like exact figures of like how effective necessarily quantitatively. I'm sure there is, even within some of the papers that I've read. I wasn't exactly looking specifically for that information, however, so I can't speak exactly to it. But what I will say is that games are an important tool, right? But they're supplement. I wouldn't say that they would replace by any means, traditional styles of learning, but I do think that they can supplement. That is what I've found overall. That's all I really have to add on this, but yeah, thought I would share.
Another interesting thing to think about that is that games could be used as a tool to learn information or to learn about how to be, how to be the part of a society, how to get your action protagonism. So it's difficult to measure about that, because you need long-term studies to see how games could affect these type of long abilities, let's say. But it's an effort that we are assembled to think about and discuss.
Well, what I'm really appreciating about all this conversation and all of the talks that we've had here so far this morning, well, right now, this might not be this morning for all of you, is the emphasis on the context and on that regionality. Because too often when we're talking about, you know, gamifying something or gamification, where it's often kind of just proposed as a monolith of an answer that, like, that's a quick fix, we can just do that. And what we're seeing very clearly is that that is not a, you know, quick, easy, or cheap solution for people around in different regions and in different areas. And I think that context, that regionality, and what's happening locally is very important, right? To think about that we can't just think about, well, what happens in my classroom is going to be exactly what happens in, you know, the next classroom, let alone like a classroom somewhere else in the world. So I think the specificity of that and the context of that is really important, that we can't just say that these are the solution or the answer, but that in these very specific contexts, these could be a solution. And right, Saullo, it might work for, you know, we've all had that where it works for one student and it just doesn't work for them for a wide variety of reasons, right? So I'm loving the emphasis on the specific and the contextual, right? All right, other questions. Question mainly for Thomas: wouldn't games promoting change on the individual level have impact than awareness raising on the macro level? This is the question that you have, Thomas. And if anybody else wants to chime in on this kind of you know, how we're using games to promote change, please feel free to add in as well.
That's a great question. I really like that question, actually. I think that it's so important, actually, to look at both. Really, it's to look at both the micro and the macro level. Specifically, the micro level, looking at, like, you know, what can we do in a community, right? Specific things, the more that you can kind of tailor it to, like, civic engagement, community engagement, looking at personal development, skill building, trying to encourage people to form good habits, and best practices, things like that. Also, I think how to work together. So in context of climate cool down, although yes, it is more of a macro scale type game, on another level, there is a lot of interaction between the players of the game, right? So there's a need, for example, to communicate with one another with what resources they have to do something, right? So in that regard, if you're looking at a lesson to be learned here on a micro level, you could say that by using diplomacy, by working together and learning how to do that in a group setting can be a really powerful skill building tool in order for people to do that same thing in their community with real issues they have. So I think there are some takeaways on the micro level with larger format, you know, macro kind of style games. There are also a lot of wonderful micro style games. One that I didn't have a chance to really talk about was ecologies, which for me, I kind of look at that as like both a micro and macro. I like the idea of kids learning, or anyone, adults, anyone alike, learning about their biomes, learning about how everything's connected together. And I think that kind of gives us an idea and respect for all life, whether it's, you know, plants, insects, birds, you know, any animals we have in our environment, kind of seeing how they're all connected. Like that's like one example, I think, of like an understanding about one's community, which is more micro. That said, I also think that the macro perspective is also very important because so much of the news we may consume, depending upon where we live, I can't speak for everyone, but I would say that, you know, there are a lot of channels which tell us how bad things are. And I think to develop an understanding and be able to create discussion around these larger issues is also a very important thing. So I wouldn't necessarily say one is better than the other or more important than the other. I think they're both very important, actually. Thank you.
Thank you. That was an excellent answer. Yeah, and I think what I'm noticing, honestly, with a lot of these conversations that we're talking about, the cooperative nature of the gameplay keeps coming up. Like many of us have in your conversations, we're either talking about maybe role-playing games, or many of these games are cooperative in nature, which I think sometimes one, if you're maybe a much more casual gamer, you might not even be familiar as much with cooperative games as a concept, right? Too often it's very focused on the competitive, we must win. You know, what does that look like? You know, not necessarily working together. So I think even that framework of changing it to the cooperative nature, we're all working together for a cause. That cause might be, you know, surviving and actually living this planet for as long as we hope we will, or just, you know, playing a fun game of Pandemic, the game version, not the game version that we lived for 3 years. But yeah, Clever, I'm going to toss it over to you now.
Yeah, it's we're talking about awareness, and it's most important, but it's interesting, like in the critical environmental education, promote action perspectives, because just awareness could paralyze us and only produce anxiety. And think about actions and put that in games and players empowered to act on those problems, and then you can transport this to real life. So students can design games or see situations portrayed in games designed for this perspective. Like in our group, Saullo, it was one of that made a game that's called in English, let's say, Restore Action. So it's about effort of a group of players in avoiding that destruction, trying to
And degradation.
Trying to avoid degradation through active action and collective action of players. So while playing, people experience like, well, collectively we could turn this to a better closure.
And in a brief talk, when players are experience this game that I made, I usually ask you what the feelings they are, and it's very common to the answers be fear, anxiety, desperation, but also the games, they also say hope, relief, and things like that, because we don't want, when education at all, not on the environment, but many other big problems that humanity are facing today, we cannot be utopic, like, no, let's put a very, very optimistic perspective and everything will be all right, don't worry. We can't do that. And also we can be, the apocalypse is coming, it's over now, pray. So it's a real challenge to find the balance that we show that it's urgent. Humanity, as long as we start talking with each other and breaking stones, We face many crises. Many civilizations have its rise and fall, and we are here. So now we are facing another big crisis. And sometimes we see, oh no, the technology will solve it. Okay, but everything has a downside. The point is what we need to change in our lifestyle, because it's a challenge. We need to change, or the world will change by itself, and we can go for it or not. So the key words for me to end my speech and give room to others is community. We need these collective games and collective actions. When we are alone, we feel even smaller than we really are. But together, with the articulation of different sectors of society and the benefits, sometimes we focus so much on difference in a bad level that we can't focus on the good part of the difference and how it can be put together to work. Then when 1+1 can be more than 2 sometimes if we work really together. So I think the point is this, to focus on actions, and we are not alone, and we need to do something.
Yeah, that is wonderful. That is a great answer, Saullo. I want to tie this back to our very first talk with Kjell and Kjell, because when you were saying, like coming together for games and trying to, taking these risks to learn, how we can, what the answer is and what the action is, I couldn't help but be struck by, but sometimes for some people, just playing the game itself is the risk, right? Not even getting to the next step, but actually just sitting down at the table, that can be a risk for some people. And so I don't know if Kjell and Kamyab, Jonathan Walton asks, and you can tie into that conversation, and also Jonathan's question kind of fits into this as well. Do you hope that the study of game communities in restricted and social political environments such as Iran will provide useful insights and techniques for folks in other places, especially as many governments seem to be becoming more repressive, right? We are very fortunate to be having this conversation right now. That might not be the case in some places, right?
Should I answer it, Kjell?
I'll let you answer it, being the Iranian here.
Sure. It's a very difficult question, because every country is in its own specific socio-political situation. So I would say it could definitely provide a lot of insight into how role-playing can affect us or enable us for political action, but not necessarily in ways that we would envision. I think it could open up the possibility in many ways, not just in what is usually considered as repressive countries, but even in countries that are considered to be democracies. And so I would say, yes, I think role-playing can provide a lot of possibility. For example, in Iran specifically, people role-play different scenarios that are metaphors for their own political situation or material situations, and they try different ways and different forms of cooperation and collective action to overcome that challenge. And I don't think that challenge is necessarily, it doesn't have to be a repressive government. It can be something else that you could collectively overcome. So I hope that answers your question.
Oh, no, it definitely does. And I very much appreciate that. And the room is exploding with applause. So yes, thank you. Kjell, did you want to add anything to that? You had unmuted for a moment.
No, I just wanted to make sure that it was Kami's question because
That's absolutely.
I am lucky enough to not live under a repressive regime. So
Yes. Okay, well, we still have a little bit of time left, and we do have a couple, yes, Arnaldo, please feel free.
I'd like to question to hear from you about possible marks of the times when people could not to play anything. Even if you are free and are restoring a culture of play there in Iran, sometimes those marks persists in several groups. I don't know if it happened with you. If, for example, you can perceive people that keeps out of games because they still have a cultural thing, an ideological process who persists even if it's not prohibited anymore and for so many years.
If I understood it correctly, you mean that in circumstances that even the government is not necessarily banning the games, there would be some sort of backlash or some sort of something preventing people from indulging in role playing. Is that?
Yes, I am thinking about you can not have a law prohibiting, but you can have a moral, for example.
Yes. Yes. So
And a mentality who says that you are born to have a right life and you have to work, and to play is not for good people. It's just in mentality, not for a law or something.
It's a very interesting topic because one thing that distinguishes a lot of countries, for example, such as Iran, in contrast with Western countries, is that we never really went through satanic panic, for example, which was a moral backlash to tabletop gaming, specifically Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing, and they were perceived as morally wrong or religiously wrong. But we never really went through that. And as of now, even among the most hardline conservatives, role-playing is not seen as something which would be morally wrong, because we just never really had that culture before. So it's a culture that is taking roots among the youth, more specifically, and it's a culture that is standing against the status quo. So even the people who are more ideologically driven would not perceive it as something that is bad because they are also against the status quo. This might change in the future, but right now, we really don't have that. There is no satanic panic.
Thank you.
All right, well, we are just about out of time. So I want to just, take a moment to thank all of our panelists again. This was an excellent way to kick off Generation Analog 2023. Wonderful conversation is happening over in the Discord. Keep it up. That will be, going all day, all night for the next, for quite a while, even afterwards. So if you want to share your slides, if you want to, if somebody has a question about what was that game you mentioned that I couldn't get a screenshot of or couldn't write down fast enough, ask those questions over in the Discord. And we will be taking a break because we all need a little bit of non-screen time too. That's always important. But we will be coming back at 12 o'clock Eastern time, so in a half hour for wherever time you're all in, for our first keynote with Jian Shim, that will be moderated by our wonderful Evan Torner. So we will all see you all back here in about a half hour, folks. Thank you so much. And yes, again, wonderful round of applause for everyone.